Given recent school tragedies, including Sandy Hook Elementary School, what do the data show with regard to trends in school safety?
It's unfortunate that the conversation around school safety had to emerge after such a tragic events like Sandy Hook and other school shootings across the country. It does point out that we have to be hypervigilant about school safety, but at the same time, we must calm our communities and ourselves and recognize that the trend of school violence is on its way down. So as much as these are isolated events, we need to recognize for what it is, and certainly we should understand that what these events have called attention to is the need for, places in schools where kids can feel safe, where they can have counselors to talk to. If mental health issues arise, there should be services for those children. So as school violence and victimization rates have gone down in many parts of the United States, and in some ways our schools are safer than some of the streets where our youth reside, we do need to recognize that as No Child Left Behind came in, it left a void, a place in which kids didn't necessarily have the opportunity to get to know a mentor, a counselor, even to really develop a deep relationship with a teacher. I believe it's called attention to, Sandy Hook has called attention to, that in some ways the pendulum has swung back to, yes, it's important to focus on academic studies and test scores and benchmarking and recovering from the test, but at the same time, we need to put back in place an opportunities for kids to talk about their non-academic life, their social life. And we know from solid years of research that the teacher-student relationship is key to the success of kids. So how can we put that back in place? But we should also all recognize that school violence trends generally are on a downward pattern.
In what ways is school bullying connected to school safety?
Right. So for 20 years, I've looked at kind of the prevalence and the correlates of those that get involved in school bullying, from the victim side, from those kids that target other children, and to those kids that are the bystanders, which represent a large percentage of the group. The reality is that we have some kids in our schools who are marginalized for different reasons, right? So it could be lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or gender nonconforming youth. It could be students with disabilities. It could be the minority, racial, or ethnic group represented in the schools. What we do know is that bullying has decreased in some contexts, but for certain subgroups, like the ones I just mentioned, the victimization continues, and we're not necessarily addressing the ways in which how to make sure that these subgroups are safe. So when we think about bullying and victimization, it's an old kind of behavior that's been in the United States schools for decades. And in some ways, it's just kind of part of the American fabric to isolate, to ostracize, to target certain groups because of the way they look, the way they act, or because of their cultural background. So we can no longer dismiss bullying as just a rites of passage, that it is a critical component when we think about promoting school safety. If we have kids from those subgroups that increasingly do not want to attend school or drop out prematurely, then we must recognize bullying and peer victimization as a clear factor in many of the kids that are victims and also those that direct aggression towards others. In some ways, we need to think about bullying not as an isolated event, but victimization and kids feeling unsafe in school as part of a larger negative school climate issue that all of us need to address.
School bullying is largely generalized as an individual white middle class, suburban, and able-bodied issue. How does research disrupt this misconception?
Yeah, bullying research has disrupted this notion that this is a problem that only kids experience in certain socioeconomic status or in some privileged school districts. The reality is that we know that there are certain groups of students, subgroups of students that are particularly elevated risk for being targets of bullies. And the reality is that those kids right now in the current research would suggest that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, and gender nonconforming youth experience higher rates of both kind of verbal and physical victimization and actual threats and outright violence compared to their straight identified peers. At the same time, as we have kids who are in special education or partially included in mainstream classrooms that may, for example, be on the spectrum along autism, we know that their social skills compromised or their challenges associated with making friends and maintaining and understanding social cues, that those students with disabilities may be at particular risk as well. Now, we've ignored that population for several decades, but now we're recognizing that they're at risk. At the same time, we're recognizing that as the demographics in our schools change, so as we have immigrant populations coming in, as we have kind of a blending of students from different cultural backgrounds, that unless we're doing a real good job to integrate all of those differences, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's disability status, whether it's race or ethnicity, cultural background, immigrant status, if we're not, as adults, understanding that we need to create safe spaces to understand and embrace that diversity, unfortunately what we're seeing in our schools is that those kids are likely to be targets and victims of bullying.
You have argued for a social ecological model for understanding school bullying. How do you translate this into school practices and policies?
The social ecological perspective is one that we've adopted. This is Ari Bronfenbrenner's classic work in understanding that the ways in which we intervene into children's lives is to understand not just their individual predispositions, but to understand how these predispositions play out in all the contexts in which they reside, including their family, their peer group, the classroom, the community, churches. And so if we really start to think about how do we take what is really rich research that supports the socio-ecological perspective, what do we do as far as school policy and practice? Well, one, we have to think about how do we make certain that kids have the skills to interact with one another. We call them socio-emotional learning skills, the empathy, the perspective taking, the listening skills, the conflict resolution, and those are all individual skills, certainly that kids need, but that's only one starting point. So if we can get even schools to put those skills back into the classroom, that we would be an advantage. At the same time, that's not enough, right? So we need to understand at the policy level how it is that we train teachers to be effective so that kids, as they improve their social skills and their social-emotional learning skills, they're interacting with an adult culture that's healthy as well. How do we include parents in this conversation? For too long in bullying research and practice, we've mostly been pointing to administrators and teachers to fix a problem that may be stemming from larger contexts. At the same time, when we look at the socio-ecological perspective, we know that school climate, those schools where kids really just don't want to be there or the adults have a negative culture, that will predict increases in bullying. So how do we think about policies where schools on a regular basis have to assess their school climate from multiple informants, right, from parents, from students, from teachers, and if they have issues where kids feel it's a negative school climate or they don't feel safe, then there has to be policies in place to address that. And I think that we're doing some of that work because we're moving really this bullying notion from just kind of bullying behavior to recognize when bullying occurs, there's often other negative types of things that are occurring in the school. So a focus on school climate is really warranted. At the same time, we have to consider, policies that put in place continual professional development about promoting school climate, increasing parental involvement. And all of this work can be done at the school, but there has to be school to community kind of linkages. We recognize a part of the social ecology includes those other contexts where kids may be. So you trained your PE teachers around effective coaching methods and effective pedagogy in PE classes. Have we reached out to the after-school programs where kids spend so much of their time? And so I think where we've done a disservice in bullying research and practice is just pointing to the schools to solve this problem, when in fact we should all own the problem. And any context in which youth reside is where we need to start doing some of this preventative work.
How do you think a social ecological model and or alternatives, such as school-wide positive behavioral support and social emotional learning can best meet the emotional and healing needs of all students?
In the best of all worlds, when there's lots of resources in schools to impact the safety of a school, certainly we do want kids to have the opportunity in schools to understand their behavioral expectations, to understand what it's like to be respectful, and to work as a community together. So positive behavior support sets that nice foundation of behavioral expectations and the need for all of us to work together in a respectful, responsible manner. At the same time, it's very clear from my perspective that kids need direct instruction around social emotional learning skills. As PBIS and social emotional learning skills are melded together, and that's kind of the trend, then we have a place for kids to start being able to interact in positive ways with their peers, with their adults, and I believe wholeheartedly that that spills over into the other contexts in home and online activities. So in some ways, a social ecological perspective is a guiding framework for how it is that we should target those individual characteristics of a child, but also understand that in order to really maximize on those social skills and social emotional learning skills kids are being taught, we have to make sure that the context in which they're embedded in are healthy. And so that's where positive behavior supports, where the teachers and administrators and parents all speak the same language around behavioral expectations, really gets to that school context and the parental context. At the same time, recognizing that we need to continually talk to kids about the other contexts that they're in. And so that draws from the socio-ecological perspective as well. So in some ways, PBIS and social emotional learning are the tools by which we can impact and create safer schools, but it's the tools by which we can enact that socio-ecological perspective that Arian Bronfenbrenner talked about beautifully, about how do we allow children to develop in these multiple contexts to be really, really healthy, to grow into healthy adults. And to do that, we have to think about behavioral expectations, giving them skills, and improving the context where they can practice these skills and really see these skills come to fruition to create healthy adults.